Let's transition. Let's go to Minnesota. Let's talk about Justin Herbert versus Kirk Cousins. It's the L.A Chargers against the Minnesota Vikings. 2-0-2 teams. The Vikings are favored by 1.5 points. It's set for a 1 o'clock kickoff in Minnesota. The over-under for this game is 54.5 points. Here's Chargers head coach Brandon Staley earlier in the week.
I'm not worried about the Jacksonville loss. The Jacksonville loss hasn't carried on to the season whatsoever. If you've seen our training camp or you've seen the way we played in the first 2 games, it hasn't had an impact on our team whatsoever. Our team is connected. Our team has played its heart out in 2 games, and we've lost 2 tough games. But it has nothing to do with the Jacksonville game. And if you ask anyone in our locker room, it has nothing to do with the Jacksonville game. And that's just the truth. It's a convenient storyline for you and for everybody else, but it's not the truth. We've lost 2 tough games, but the guys in that locker room, the men in that locker room, they are finishers and they have what it takes, and we're excited to prove ourselves. We just lost a game in overtime, Jeff, so how do you think the mood is? How do you think the mood is? How do you think it is? It's tough. It's tough. It's a tough group in there. There's a lot of pride in that room, okay? And we put a lot into this, and we got a good football team. And so we've lost 2 tough games. We've got to bounce back, learn from our mistakes, and be ready for Minnesota.
That was Chargers head coach Brandon Staley earlier this week, getting a little feisty with reporters. So when I look at the L.A Chargers, it's crazy because so far this season, Justin Herbert has played well. He has 3 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 534 passing yards. He has a pretty decent completion percentage. And when you look at the Chargers overall as a football team, the Chargers have scored 58 points in 2 games with 0 turnovers. And they're 0-2. 0-2, and they've scored 58 points in 2 games. And Justin Herbert is playing at a high level. He's been playing at a high level for the last 4 games. Chargers are 0-4 in those games. Here's Justin Herbert's stats. 7 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, completing 65% of his passes. His passer rating is 98.4. This is dating back to last season. Justin Herbert has played sensational. And that Chargers offense has played well in these first 2 weeks of the season. Against the Miami Dolphins in week 1, they put up 34 points. And in that matchup, they had over 400 total yards for the game, even had 234 rushing yards for the game. And then against the Titans last week, a game in which I picked the Chargers to beat the Titans because the Chargers are just simply more talented than the Titans are. They're more talented than the Titans are. And I picked the Chargers to win the game. And even in that matchup, the Chargers had over 250 passing yards, had more yards than the Titans did, and Herbert outplayed Tannehill. Tannehill played well in that matchup, went 20 of 24, 246 yards, but Justin Herbert had 305 passing yards, 27 of 41, 2 touchdowns. But for whatever reason, the Chargers are sitting here 0-2. But the main reason why the L.A. Chargers are 0-2 to start the season is because their head coach name is Brandon Staley. Ladies and gentlemen, at some point, the L.A. Chargers ownership has to realize we are wasting Justin Herbert's prime. Because we have a head coach in Brandon Staley whose calling card is supposed to be defense, his defense has been arguably the worst defense in the NFL in these first 2 games. Let's look at the numbers. In the first 2 games, the Chargers defensively have given up 32 points per game. That's ranked 30th in the NFL. They've given up 438 yards per game. That's ranked dead last in the NFL. They've given up 333 passing yards per game. That's ranked dead last in the NFL. They've also given up 6.9 yards per play, which is also ranked dead last in the NFL. They've also given up 18 big plays in 2 games. That's ranked 31st in the NFL. They have made Tua Tagovailoa and Ryan Tannehill look like the second coming of Tom Brady or Aaron Rodgers. They got these guys out there looking like they're actually elite quarterbacks and going to the Hall of Fame. Neither Ryan Tannehill or Tua Tagovailoa are going to the Hall of Fame right now. Tua, maybe. We'll see what happens. He's still got a long way to go in his career. Ryan Tannehill, there's no way in hell he's going to be in the Hall of Fame. But the Chargers defense has allowed Tua and Ryan Tannehill to both look like they're elite, and they are not. This is the Chargers defense that has Joey Bosa up front. They also have Khalil Mack as well as a pass rusher. In their secondary, they got J.C. Jackson, they got Derwin James, Asante Samuel. So they have the personnel to be at least an average defense. So why are they struggling? They're struggling because Brandon Staley is their head coach. And at some point, we got to start recognizing what's going on in L.A. On Monday, I got people on Twitter hitting me up, and I'm seeing conversations on Twitter. You got to think about L.A. In L.A., the Lakers, the Dodgers, the Trojans, these are the Rams. All 4 of those teams that I just named are all more important to L.A. fans than the Chargers are. So I think the Chargers actually made a mistake even moving to L.A. to begin with. But nobody cares about the Chargers in L.A. But the talk of the town this week has been about Brandon Staley. That's been the talk of the town. And it's funny because, like I said, they made a mistake even moving to L.A. They should have stayed in San Diego. Because when opposing teams' fan bases come into L.A. and they play against the Chargers at SoFi Stadium, their fan base outnumbers the Chargers fan base. The Raiders play the Chargers in L.A. here in a few weeks, possibly next week. I think. I can't remember exactly. It may be next week. That's going to be more Raider fans than Charger fans at SoFi Stadium. So that's my outlook right now on the Chargers. Now, let's switch gears to the Minnesota Vikings. So far this season, the Minnesota Vikings have struggled defensively and also being able to run the football. But the one bright spot for the Minnesota Vikings has been Kirk Cousins. So far this season, Kirk Cousins, 6 touchdowns, only 1 interception, 708 passing yards. Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson have been balling. But the problem for the Minnesota Vikings is they don't have a true running game. Now, they traded for Cam Akers earlier this week. So maybe Cam Akers could come in and help them in their running game. But in week 2 against the Eagles, the Vikings had 28 rushing yards. Against the Buccaneers in week 1, they had 41 rushing yards. And you look at them from a statistical standpoint, 69 total rushing yards so far this season. That's ranked dead last in the NFL. They're averaging 2.7 yards per rush. That's ranked 30th in the NFL. They have zero 10-yard rushes so far this season. That also is ranked dead last in the NFL. And those total yards that they've gained in 2 games, the 69 yards, that's the fewest through 2 games in team history. So they're a one-dimensional football team. They are Kirk Cousins or bust. They don't have a running game to speak of. And that's been the biggest issue in these first 2 weeks of the season for the Minnesota Vikings. So they have Cam Akers now in that running back room with Alexander Mattison and Ty Chandler. Maybe Cam Akers can help them in their running game. Maybe, maybe not. We'll see what happens. But obviously, they still have Justin Jefferson, a top 5 receiver in the NFL. You still got KJ Osborne. You got Jordan Addison out of USC. He's a rookie. And I said, coming into the season, I feel like the Vikings are going to struggle because they moved on from Dalvin Cook and Adam Thielen. And offensively, they have struggled. And if it's not Kirk Cousins and Justin Jefferson, their offense has not done much. Now, I like TJ Hawkinson as a tight end, but they got to get more production from their running game. They got to get more production from their running game. But also, defensively, the Minnesota Vikings, they're led by defensive coordinator Brian Flores. This Minnesota Vikings defense, they're not very good. They allowed Baker Mayfield in week 1 to ball out. In week 1, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they had over 200 yards for the game. Baker Mayfield had 173 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, very efficient game for Baker Mayfield, and they controlled the game start to finish in that game. The Buccaneers controlled that week 1 game against the Minnesota Vikings. And then against the Philadelphia Eagles in week 2, they played from behind all night. They played from behind all night because that Vikings defense, they're not very good. At one point, the Vikings were up 27-7 on the Eagles. The Eagles were up 27-7 on the Vikings in week 2. And so I don't believe in that Vikings defense. Up front, they got Dean Lowry, Harrison Phillips, Daniel Hunter, Ivan Pace Jr., Jordan Hicks. But that Vikings defense, they're not very good. And so this is going to be a high-scoring affair. It's going to be a very, very high-scoring affair. And these are 2 teams who are both 0-2 who cannot afford to go 0-3. But honestly, I feel like the Vikings could afford to go 0-3 before the Chargers could, because the Chargers are in the AFC. The Vikings are in the NFC. And the AFC is a much more tougher conference than the NFC. So Chargers fall to 0-3. They got a lot of competition in the AFC with the Chiefs, Jaguars, Ravens. At some point, you expect the Bengals to come along. You got teams like the Dolphins. The Chargers have more competition in the AFC. In the NFC, the Vikings, even if they lose this game, they still got games against Green Bay twice. They still got to play Detroit twice. And so you feel like this game, even though these 2 teams are both 0-2, this game means much more to the Chargers than it does the Vikings. And also, both teams next week, the Chargers, they have the Raiders. Yep, you got Raiders week 4 in L.A., and the Vikings have the Carolina Panthers. So those are 2 winnable games for the Chargers and the Vikings in week 4. Whichever team falls to 0-3, they got a winnable game in week 4. So that's something to also keep in mind. But with all that being said, I'm rolling with the team that has the better quarterback. I'm rolling with the team that is a much more complete football team from top to bottom. So I'm rolling with the L.A Chargers to beat the Minnesota Vikings in Minnesota 31-28. If you're a betting man or woman out there, go and take the over, because I expect these 2 teams and these 2 high-powered offenses to slug it out. But I got Justin Herbert, 31, Kirk Cousins, 28.